Hi, this is my review of Warcraft, the board game. I'm also reviewing the expansion set. These boxes are somewhat funny because you can use them kind of like masks. Like, we used to fool around a bit like that. Well, this video is sort of like a continuation of my video response to Multiversal Distópico. I'm going to put a link in the description below because I talk a bit about what I liked about old school Blizzard and Warcraft and such. And well, when it comes to my background related to this board game, I think that this board game, that is with the expansion, it's one of the best fantasy war themed board games that I have ever played. But you need to play with the expansion. Without the expansion, it feels somewhat lukewarm or lackluster in some aspects. And I'm not a fan of how Fantasy Flight Games is running things. I think that this board game started to show some of the signs that I do not like of their business model and how they are focused on milking the product at the expense of the customer. You can see some of my criticism regarding that in a video I'm going to put in a link in the description below. It's my review of the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition box set. I touch a bit on those points of the things that I don't like about Fantasy Flight Games, and I think that there are some examples of that in this board game. We will see a bit more about that in a few minutes. Well, this board game seeks to recreate the experience of the Warcraft 3 computer game. This is definitely the version that represents Warcraft 3. As you can tell from the graphics, those are illustrations from the third part in the series. And I think that it manages to capture a great part of the essence of that computer game, but it's so well executed that I even think that even if it didn't have the Warcraft theme, if it were to be called something like a generic fantasy resource battle game or something like that, I think it would still work despite the generic theme. Now let's talk about the quality of the components, and I'm going to talk about both the expansion and the base game components because I have them all mixed together between the two boxes. And really the boxes aren't that big, so I think this would have been better released as a single box instead of spreading it into two products. They obviously did that to get more money out of it. Now let's talk about the quality. The boxes are quite flimsy. As you can see, this box is already falling apart. This box has held together a bit better, but I've been extra careful with it. And funny thing is that this is actually the Spanish and Brazilian version. I got this in Mexico City. You even have the letters in Portuguese and Spanish. And you know what's somewhat funny as well? In the computer games in Mexico, we usually receive the Spain version of those games. So we had the game translated to instead of español, it would be español or castellano. So it was quite funny because I don't know why, but there were many characters in those games, especially the Blizzard games, but in Baldur's Gate as well, that had really weird, somewhat funny voices. So and you would hear voices like "Ashika quieres machacarme," like he was choking on something. And I've been to Spain, and I never heard anybody speaking like that. So I didn't get why they use those like choky voices in many of those games. It was really weird. Now, the inside of each box contains a plastic insert. It's going to be somewhat difficult for me to show it to you, but it's a black plastic insert that protects the entire contents quite well. And I actually used a lot of plastic bags as well to add further protection, but there isn't a way to effectively separate all the components. That's a bit slightly disappointing, and you get a lot of high quality components. You have all of these tokens that represent wood, and let me see if I can get that into focus. As you can see, this is a wood, and you also have gold, because just like a computer game, you're going to be generating resources, and you also have these little tokens, or sort of like chips, that represent when something is out of gold or out of wood. That is, you can actually mine a certain place, and there's no more gold in it, or decimate a forest. And that's part of the strategy of the game. Sometimes you run out of resources. And you also have 6-sided die. You have 4 6-sided die, if I'm not mistaken. And that's when you use them during combat. And you also have this die right here that represents when you are collecting wood or gold. You roll the dice, and it tells you what how many gold pieces or wood you get. And you're unlucky, you could start draining that mine or forest of its resources. Eventually you will have no more gold or no more wood. You also have this came with the expansion. These are wound tokens. They're to mark when your hero has been wounded. I'll talk about heroes later on. You also have these pieces of the map. This is a modular map, so you start building the battlefield like this, and you start creating the where you're going to fight those battles. And as you can see, you have different sort of terrain, even though terrain isn't that important when it comes to modifiers in battle. That is, it's mostly like an obstacle. For example, mountains and rivers, you cannot cross them unless you use flyers. And as you can see, those 2 cottages in there, they are worth victory points, and that's a way that you can win the game. You also have this sort of like panels that show you the main buildings. You're going to using these panels to build all the specialized structures where you produce the units, different types of warriors, etc. They are hexagons, and you start building them downward. This is actually quite handy because it includes all the prices, what you need in terms of wood and gold to build the different buildings. You also have tokens for the workers, the guys you're going to be using to collect gold and wood. And you have some tokens representing the different units that you're going to use to fight. For example, these are flyers, and as you level them up by paying gold and wood and building different structures, they level up, and they are actually better at fighting. They usually also give you a victory point when you make them evolve to its more powerful state. And you get these sort of like wooden miniatures. They're kind of like meeples, and you have like this little dragon that represents flying units. You have this sort of like very meeple-like token or miniature that represents melee. And you have these small catapults that represent ranged units, ranged combat. And you also get this star, and this represents the hero. And this is the most powerful unit in your army. You also have cards for different factions. These are the cards for the human faction. And you also have cards that represent heroes and just different heroes and their states of evolution, so to speak. So for example, this is the human deck, and you have the paladin. And as you level up your heroes, they get more and more abilities. So now, for example, let's say that you level up your paladin and you overlap the cards so that you start getting more and more abilities. He can use all of those abilities until the point that he actually has a lot of options in battle, kind of like this. Let me see if I can get that into the abilities stack. Some of the components fell apart right here. Okay. Now let's talk about the rulebook. You have two rulebooks, but actually they are three if you purchase the Portuguese Spanish version, because you have a rulebook in Spanish, and the Brazilian one in Portuguese. Something that I also didn't like about when this game first came out was that there was a significant revision or errata as expected of many of Fantasy Flight games. It seems like they don't play test things enough, and they always have significant errata, and that's somewhat disappointing. However, they also released a scenario creation guide, so that's quite nice. But the errata was really needed. It fixed some things. Humans got the short end of the stick when the base game came out. It was really disappointing to play with them, but after the errata and some of the additions of the expansion, it was pretty good. Now the base game contained just the necessary things to play. That you had all the pieces for the board, the wooden miniatures, the worker markers, and all the panels to build your structures, different cards, gold, and some tokens for specialized scenarios. And as a standalone game that is with just the core game, the experience felt somewhat lackluster, as I was telling you, especially in the sense that each of the different races that you could control, or rather factions, because you have different races within the factions. That is, humans, the human army is composed of dwarves and elves as well, and you have the orcs that also have trolls, and the night elves also have giants, and the undead are basically just a bunch of different undead. They still felt somewhat not as original as the differences between them were very slight. So, for example, humans tended and the undead were somewhat balanced or flexible. They didn't stand out too much in, let's say, melee or flying or ranged attacks, but they were decent in all areas, and they were somewhat more defensive. And the orcs were really powerful in melee, but very weak when using flyers, and the night elves were very powerful with their ranged attackers, but it still didn't feel enough. Each faction has a deck of cards that allows you to use different things depending on the faction. So, for example, humans could use the call to arms, where you actually transformed your workers into melee units, and the night elves usually had something that empowered their ability to cause damage. The orcs had something that enabled them to melee against flying units and steal resources, and the undead had things to mess up your enemy's plan, especially when it comes to movement. And the different units also have different powerful abilities that you could use. So, for example, the undead had necromancers that could raise dead during combat. So a relatively small unit of necromancers had a bit of a chance of handling larger armies or units, and the humans had the healing ability, but this was really weak. When it first came out, the errata was really needed. It almost brought nothing to the table when it comes to humans acting, the alliance being a sort of like a power to face in the battlefield. And the orcs had things that enhanced their melee capabilities. The night elves, something that enhanced their first strike abilities, because in combat, ranged units attack first. So if you have a lot of ranged units, you had a chance to wipe out your opponent at the very beginning. But melee units were quite hardy. That is, they had a bit more staying power, especially with different cards and different powers, such as healing. The melee units were also cheaper to produce, And the flying units were superb, but really expensive. And if you were an orc player, it was somewhat difficult to be competent and flying. So the base game, it felt like you had very little options, and it was quite inexcusable that you didn't have heroes. If you the base game did not include anything about heroes, and obviously a way to milk the game, because Warcraft 3 had and it was very characteristic, almost like a staple of the game, that it had powerful heroes that you could level up, and they didn't include them in the base game. That's ridiculous. And you had to buy the expansion for that. So the expansion added the following. You had new building tiles and new outpost markers, because you could build your base or outpost in different parts of the map. And you also have the hero markers and crypt markers. Now crypts are a great addition, and it made the battlefield come alive a bit, because with the base game the battlefield felt quite empty. You could move around everywhere with no risk. It felt like the entire world was just populated by you and your opponents. This game could be played between 2 and 4 players, and even so, it felt really empty, like somewhat unrealistic within the fantasy context and out of theme with the computer game. But the crypts, well, they are basically independent creatures that can actually, they're quite powerful and can wipe out an entire unit of an entire small army if they are not careful. And they also serve as a tool for your heroes to level up. You kill them to gain experience, and you get more powerful. You also had new summon creature markers for the new abilities of the heroes, and research tokens, new experience cards with more powers. I will talk a bit more about that in a little bit. And all the tokens necessary to carry out all the different scenarios in the expansion. Now, why is it that the expansion improved things so much? Well, because it added a lot of customization. It added tactical depth to the game, and it was more feasible or workable to employ different strategies. So for example, normally you would say, night elves, well, they are more of a ranged type of attack, so I'm not going to be pretty good at melee. But if you chose Illidan, or the demon hunter, as your hero, you had the potential to become the most powerful melee fighter in the entire game, especially with the new experience cards, that is the powers that you use in your deck. You could really customize a night elf force to be efficient in melee. You would never be able to match the orcs when it comes to using all of the cards and all of the hero characters, but they were really, really powerful. And the demon hunter, some players consider him somewhat unbalanced. I personally don't think he was so unbalanced, because I have won in the past against the demon hunter with some experienced players, and it's all basically on the tactics that you employ. Basically, Demon Hunter becomes the most powerful unit in the entire game if you level him up to level 3. But it also makes you like the target of everyone. For example, in a free-for-all game, if you chose the Demon Hunter, everybody was going to be, get that guy, we need to kill that guy immediately, and you're going to be like... and if you played against another player, there were strategies to go around it. You could start eliminating all the creeps so that Illidan didn't level up, or you could start using effects to make the player spend all his cards before he could power up activate his ability, because heroes have different special powers, but their abilities cost mana, and mana is indicated by right here, as you can see, those two like little circles, and that's 2 mana in this case. So you had to choose if you wanted to use the special ability of this card. In this case, it's Call to Arms. This is different from the special ability of your units. This allows you to use workers as melee fighters, but in any place in the map, within any area. Because in the computer game you could only do that in the city. Your workers would enter your main building and they would come out equipped to fight. But with this one you can use that capability anywhere in the map, and that's pretty cool, because you could like move around some workers and your enemies will be like, oh, he's just moving those weak workers that aren't good at fighting, and you would use call to arms and you would surprise your opponent. And so that added a lot of things to the game. You had different heroes with special abilities, and the opponent, there were many times he didn't know what to expect. And with the different abilities of the heroes, some of the armies were radically altered. So for example, with the orcs, you could make your melee capability even stronger with heroes such as this one, the Tauren Chieftain. He could actually come back to life, so he had a lot of staying power during a fight. The opponent, if he didn't end things quickly, it could turn out pretty bad for him. You also had this troll, the Shadow Hunter, and with his healing capabilities and summoning capabilities, he had a pretty good chance at neutralizing some of the effects from the humans and the undead. And each faction gets 4 heroes, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a lot. That's 4 different ways. Because of their special abilities, it really modifies the way you play each faction. You had 4 ways of modifying your game style. And that's quite disappointing. For example, not that, but I mean in present times, if Fantasy Flight Games were to release Warcraft, the board game, they wouldn't have included 4 heroes for each faction in the expansion. They would have included a single hero, and they would have tried to milk the product, releasing all the other heroes separately in probably $10 packs. And they would have they wouldn't have included this token to represent the hero, this wooden miniature. They would have used some flimsy, cheaper token to represent it. And if you want something to represent your hero, purchase this separately. So that's a bit disappointing. Even though this Warcraft board game had some things that are better, in my opinion, when it comes to the current Fantasy Flight games that do not include miniatures. But it still felt like they were starting to milk the product. And when it comes to more things that the expansion improves, it also includes these sheets that had all the special abilities and the turn structure. But it also added additional abilities to each faction, which was sorely needed in the base game. So for example, the elves could use their all of their buildings to walk around. Your base building became sort of like a living unit, like an ant in Lord of the Rings, for those that are not familiar with the Warcraft PC game. And you could move your base around and surprise your opponent. If your mine was depleted, you could play this ability and you will have an entire new base with new resources. And the undead, they were quite fast at building structures, because they summoned those structures, so your workers would be able to do something else. And you could use your ghouls to collect wood, so that was pretty useful as well. The Human Alliance had cooperative building as well, that allows them to build structures faster. As I was telling you, the undead and the humans feel slightly alike. Maybe the main difference is that humans focus a bit more on preserving their units, and the undead on sabotaging the other players' movements and abilities. And the orcs had the protective burrows, which are kind of like bunkers, so they added a lot of more protection to their bases, because orcs felt somewhat more offensive. So, and how the game proceeds, it's actually quite simple. You move your units around, and because they don't move too much, you use a smaller map. So you usually move like from zone to zone, but sometimes you could move up to 2 or 3 zones depending on abilities. But it was still a small area of gameplay, and that was quite nice, especially for these war-themed games where usually they take a lot of table space at times. And After that, you would harvest, you would roll your red die and collect wood and gold, and then you would deploy units that you started to build or train in other turns. And in the step 4 is probably the most strategic phase or step in the turn, because you had to choose if you wanted to train more workers or soldiers, or if you wanted to construct new buildings, or if you wanted to upgrade one of your units. And you really had to put a lot of thought into things. So for example, if you were had your base and your opponent was not attacking you, you could decide to build a structure or level up one of your units. But if your enemy was getting too close for comfort, you needed to build soldiers and repel that enemy. And it also had the presence of creeps in the map also had you thinking, is this the best way to do things? Should I use my hero and attack that group of unknown creeps over there? And you had to think about many things, because for example, if you attacked those creeps with a hero with very few units, maybe a couple of melee units, some creeps would be pretty powerful and they were turned upside down. You didn't know their combat potential, and your hero could end up dying, and that's the worst thing that could happen in this game. You can resurrect your hero by paying a hefty price, but it wasn't worth it to have your hero resurrecting, but you could use all that wood and gold to build a structure or level up some other unit. So when your hero died, it felt almost like you had lost the game. There were a few times that a player managed to turn the situation around, but you really had to take that into consideration. And as I was telling you, all of the different hero abilities really modified the factions. So for example, the human player, he had the wizard as a hero. He had an ability that was like mass teleport, and he could actually finish off an opponent attacking the base when he didn't expect it. And the game is normally played with a generic scenario of killing your opponent that is destroying his base and his units, or by gaining victory points. You got an amount of victory points. I think it was 30, and you would win the game if you had that amount. That usually felt too like it didn't modify things as much, because by the time you got all those victory points, you had already almost killed your opponent, so there wasn't really much of a difference. However, the expansion did offer a strategic form of gameplay in which you only needed 20 victory points, and that was a lot better. Some players, myself included, actually won the game several times when you had almost your entire army wiped out, but you had some units in different parts of the map that were worth a number of victory points, and you won the game, surprising everyone. So that was quite nice, because in that, yeah, it's more depth. You didn't feel like you had to kill everything on the map to win. And it also added some other things like limited resources. Normally you roll the die to see how much wood and gold you want, but you could also use these tokens that were placed with the value with the value placed downwards, so that you didn't know how much gold or how much wood was at that particular area. So you were always risking it, and maybe you want to take control of that forest or that mine, but then you flip the token and oh no, it wasn't worth it. So there were ways to add more strategic depth to the game. And once things started to go on, it just felt really fast, really intuitive. Kind of felt like the Hackmaster role-playing game, that it feels that you're playing basically second by second, and here each turn felt like it was just a few seconds, and that it almost felt like all the players were playing at the same time, especially in combat. And in combat, when you engage an opponent, let's say that you fight here, all of the adjacent areas, if they have units, that would be over here, they would participate in combat as well. So there were a lot of things that you could do using units, using cards, and both rulebooks for the expansion and the core game also had different scenarios with objectives. So maybe you had to escort someone, maybe you had to rescue some player characters or get your hands on a specific token. There were shrines and centers of power and artifacts on the battlefield that you could use to use some special effects and abilities that could wipe out units. Some of them had like elemental things that provoked disasters or boosted up your forces, and that added a little bit more when it comes to the things that you could do each game. Sadly, again, there was the errata had some corrections when it comes to those scenarios, because some of them weren't that well thought out. Well, overall, what do I think of Warcraft the board game? This is actually one of my favorite fantasy war themed games. With the expansion, you can't wait to play the next game and to choose a different hero, with 4 factions, with 4 different heroes each, and with different cards, with different abilities and powers and effects that allow you to steal resources, that allow you to paralyze units, that allow you to enhance your battle potential. It was just a pleasure to play. I also liked combat quite a lot. It was quite simple. You rolled a 6-sided die and you tried to roll below a certain number, and you would get a casualty, and some other powers would activate. That is, if you roll a 1, you would raise the dead, or you would heal someone, etc. I also enjoyed how the heroes leveled up. It added a bit of an RPG element to the entire game. But this game really needed to be released as a single big box game, not as 2 separate things. When I first got the base game, I was highly disappointed. It wasn't a terrible game, but it was just too lukewarm. Like, oh yeah, well, that's nice, but you weren't as excited about playing next time. But I saw some details on the expansion, and I decided to get it. It felt really nice. It added so much to the base game. But as I was telling you, in my opinion, that wasn't needed. They should have included heroes with the base game. And this is an example of when things started to get, they started to milk things. But I was telling you, it could have been a lot worse. They could have released an expansion for each of those heroes. I could definitely see the present Fantasy Flight games releasing these like booster packs for each of those heroes. That would be quite ridiculous. So this is actually out of print. If you see this game perhaps on eBay or Amazon, if you see just the base game, if it's too expensive, probably if it's over $50, I wouldn't get it. But if you see it with the expansion, being sold with the expansion, I think it's actually worth it to get it. Even if it were to be around like 80 or $90, I think it would be worth it to get it. It's a really fun game, and I haven't seen something similar lately. I'm also curious about that. Maybe there's some other Fantasy Flight games, war game out there that uses the same structure, because Fantasy Flight games does a lot of that. Most of the time they grab one of their old systems and they just reskin it with something trendy like Star Wars or whatever, and it sells like hot bread. So maybe there's one of their games that actually uses the structure for this board game. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.